everyone. My name is Hannah Rittner. I'm the curator in residence at the Stratford Festival this year, and also the curator of the Uprising series, which is presented by the Meighen Forum on August 18th to 21st. Today, we're discussing the last of the plays that is going to be presented, Wedding Band by Alice Childress. Just an absolutely phenomenal play that I'm so excited to share with you all on August 21st at 8 p.m. And it's going to be directed by the fantastic Vanessa Sears. Joining us today, I am so incredibly grateful to be speaking with Kathy Perkins, who herself was mentored by Alice during the last 10 years of her life. Kathy is a scholar and a lighting designer, and she will in fact be designing the upcoming Broadway debut of Trouble in Mind by Alice. So welcome, Kathy, how are you?
I'm great, excited to be here, thank you.
So the first thing I wanted to start with is, introducing people to Alice's work. From reading Wedding Band specifically, it was so clear to me that Alice herself was such a thoughtful, passionate, and incredibly brilliant woman that had lots to say about America in the context that she was living in and also prior to. So from what you know, what about her background do you think informed her ability to be able to tell these incredible stories?
She grew up in South Carolina. She was born in 1916, and she left for New York when she was about 9 to live with her grandmother. And her grandmother was the biggest inspiration in her life. Her grandmother was an amazing storyteller. Childress always said if her grandmother had maybe been a woman of a different color or something, she probably would have been a famous writer or something like that, a famous storyteller. But she told Childress stories of growing up in the South, and this is where Wedding Band comes in. And she read to her all the time, and she talked about when they would see people walking down the street, they would make stories of, oh, there's this man carrying this something, let's make a story about him. So, her grandmother was an amazing inspiration. And just before her death, she was working on, I don't know if it was a biography, she was working on a book about her grandmother and how much she inspired her. Because Childress did not finish high school. She did not have a college degree. She was sort of taught by her grandmother, although she did go to high school and stuff, but she gives her grandmother credit for, the education that she had. She was an amazing person. Like you said, I knew her the last 10 years of her life, but I knew about her when I got to Howard University in the 70s, and Howard is a historically Black college in Washington, D.C. And the first play I worked on as a freshman was a play by Alice Childress. And not knowing about 12 years later that I would be working with this phenomenal woman. And then today that I'd be designing her show on Broadway, which was supposed to have been on Broadway 65 years ago. So this is really a special time for me. And I'm just happy to see that there's such an interest in her work right now.
I'd love to hear a little bit more, of course, her grandmother, I remember too reading a bit, encouraging her to read, self-teach, be this independent thinking woman, which is incredible. But I'd love to hear a little bit more too about the genesis of how you think, her playwriting career started. I know that she trained at A&T, which was an incredible sort of laboratory for some of the most important Black actors at the time. I think our audience would be very curious about how the genesis of her playwriting kind of began from being an actor to a playwright.
Childress started acting when she was a teenager. And there was this woman named Venezuela Jones, and this was like in the 30s, she said was the first professional Black theater artist that she knew. And this woman sort of taught her acting. She taught her about theater. And this particular woman, Venezuela Jones, had worked with the Federal Theater Project. She had taught at a historically Black college in Mississippi called Russ College. And, she migrated to New York to teach Black actors. So that's how she got her first start. And then she would do acting around Harlem. And interesting enough, she also worked with a Jewish theater company because Childress was so light she could pass. And that was always an issue for her. But, they gave her work and she wanted to work, and, she got great reviews on these shows.
For playing Jewish women, I remember.
Playing a Jewish woman, yes. There was one piece that she was in that playwright Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote A Raisin in the Sun, which was the first play by a Black woman on Broadway, if anybody knows of her. She critiqued this particular play that she was in. And then she became involved with the American Negro Theater. She was with them from like 1941 to 1949. That was a major influence on her life because she had a chance to work with all these wonderful actors that came through there, like Sidney Poitier, Harry Belafonte, Ruby Dee, Ossie Davis, Hilda Haynes, and the list goes on and on. Well, they weren't famous at the time, but they became famous as a result of American Negro Theater. And so with American Negro Theater, I mean, this was a small group. They didn't have any money. They were in Harlem at what's called the Schomburg now, was one of the New York Public Libraries. And nobody got paid, but they got a lot of training there. They would have professionals come in and train them in playwriting and lighting and acting, pretty much everything. And so they were just such an amazing group. And she talked about, had it not been for the American Negro Theater, she wouldn't really be how she got to where she is, because she learned everything there. She realized that there were very few plays written by women there, because most of the plays were written by Black men, even though there weren't a lot of plays written by Black men either. She was encouraged by Abram Hill, who was the director of A&T, to start directing, not so much writing a play, but he encouraged her to direct, because there weren't many Black women there directing. Mm-hmm. And she decided she just wanted to write a play. She wasn't trained as a playwright. She got into an argument one evening at her house. Sidney Poitier was there, and he vaguely remembers it. He said, I was so busy eating the food that she was preparing. I said, she was always arguing about something with us. And, somebody made a comment about, no one wants to read a play about some average, Black woman or somebody that no one knows. They want to hear about famous people. And she said, I'm going to prove that that's a lie. So that night she wrote her first play called Florence. And this was in 1949. So that sort of started her playwriting career. And it was produced through the A&T at two different places. Childress directed it. Her close friend Clarice Taylor was in the play. And it was the second time it was done. Childress was in it. She played the white woman. It's a confrontation between a Black and a white woman at a segregated train station in the South. A lot of her earlier works dealt with confronting racism. Yeah. And what was so unique about Childress, and these are her plays before the 70s, before the late 60s, that it was very rare to see a Black playwright with whites in their plays, and particularly with whites that they confronted regarding social and racial issues, and particularly a woman.
Exactly, yeah.
So that was what was so unique about her work, her earlier work. She had white characters on the stage, and she confronted them about their racism, about situations for Black people in America. And so that was disturbing for many white producers. They didn't want to, they wanted, it's okay to bring up these topics, but we really want to hear it from the white male's perspective. It was always about, let's change the story so it's from the white male's perspective.
And also with happy endings. I think
with happy ending, yes.
I think Trouble in Mind, they were forcing her to do all these rewrites to the point where she didn't even recognize the play anymore.
Right. And the first time it was produced, she did create a happy ending, which she said she always regretted. But
and also on top of all that, which is such a great way to segue into the actual story of Wedding Band and giving our audience a sense of what it's about, is the thing that also for me struck such a chord right now when I read it was, I think we're really in a point too where we're really examining white women's roles in systematic racism, and which has always been the case, like, of course, being marginalized as women, but they are also often very much actively part of policing Black people and Black women specifically. And Florence is a great sort of like distilled version of that. But I think Wedding Band kind of elaborates that on such a large scale, when we meet Herman's family. So I would love to hear your, in your words, what is this play about? What's the story? And let's kind of get into what moves us about it,
Well, I can tell you what she told me about the play.
Yeah,
because when we first talked about doing an anthology of her plays, she talked about certain plays, not specific to everything, but she talked about how Wedding Band came about because she got annoyed that people kept thinking that Wedding Band was about her life, that she was the product of Herman and Julia, because again, Childress was very, very fair. And she said, no, it was nothing about my life. My father was Black, he was light skinned, my mother was Black, and I've never dated a white man, so it wasn't even about that. And she said the story, she was fascinated because her grandmother told her a story. And this is sort of based on a true event. She said, my grandmother told me about this Black woman who had to hide around from one place to another because she was dating this white guy who was a butcher. And she just said, as she started writing a play, she just said, maybe butcher's not appropriate. Let me just make him a baker. It just sounds better.
Butcher would be too brutal.
Yeah, she said, no, butcher, no, let's make him a baker. Let's make him a baker.
Yeah.
And I don't remember all the details that her grandmother told her, but Childress had to do more with the story than just say it's about this interracial couple. But she wanted to bring up the whole issue of what was happening with Black people during, World War I, the whole issue of Black men coming back to, and again, this is why the history is so important. The whole thing about Black men coming back in uniform, being lynched, being beaten on the street. In the play, Maddie, who is the adopted mother of Nelson, the young Black man who's come back from the military, how she's trying to protect him. She's really trying to protect him. It's like, don't walk around in that uniform, because, white people, beat you or lynch you or whatever. So she wanted to discuss that issue. She also wanted to talk about the issue of community. How Julia comes into this community, she doesn't feel like she belongs, but in the end, she does. These women embrace her, and how she feels like she's been ashamed of her life because she is dating Herman, this white guy. And again, it's the 10-year anniversary of their, being a couple, but they can't get married because of laws. And there was another thing that Childress is trying to do with this play, saying how laws in this country prevent people from getting together, from loving each other. And usually the laws are so much against Black women, because we see in the play, Maddie, I'm sorry, Lula has the son Nelson, I'm sorry. Maddie has the little girl and who has the husband overseas. Although he's not a husband, she can't marry him because her first husband is left, and in the state of South Carolina, they can't get a divorce. So she looks at all these laws that are oppressive to women. So she's telling that story, and she's also telling the story about, again, this whole thing of sisterhood, that racism isn't just, white men oppressing Black people, but white women play a major role as well. And I love the fact that she used this pandemic, which I thought was so clever, to be able to get these white women to come to her yard, to her home. Because we're talking about, I grew up in the segregated South in the late 50s and the 60s. You never see white women coming into a Black family's home. That was just unheard of. So you hear in 1918, these two white women coming into a Black neighborhood. And they were only able to do that because of the pandemic. It was a crisis thing. They had to come and get Herman, and they had to come. So I thought that was really ingenious how she devised the story. So we get to see Herman's mother and the sister, and they have this whole racial confrontation. And she's also showing how, disrespected Black women are. We have the guy who's coming and selling stuff. It's like, hey, auntie, and he just walks into her house. Yes. So that becomes an issue. But what I find interesting as I read this play is like, this is today. You know, here we are 103 years later. We're still having the same problems. All right. What's interesting, we're in a pandemic too. And what has happened during the pandemic has really allowed racism to emerge in one of its ugliest forms. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the stuff you see, you know, people don't confront each other face to face. They do it in chat rooms. They do it, you know, on TikTok and Instagram, and, you know, and then we're not confronted with lynching as they were in 1918, but we're still confronted with the issue of violence. Not only policemen, but people saying, oh, I saw this Black guy and I was scared of him, so I just shot him. So it's almost the same thing. And you're hearing Black women still talking about, as in Wedding Band, you know, protecting their sons. I told my son, don't go anywhere, don't go to this neighborhood because I don't want him shot, you know. So it's a lot of the same thing. And the whole, you know, also the disrespect of Black women. And I don't know if we're supposed to get political, but we saw this during the Trump administration. I mean, whenever Trump had a chance, he just berated any Black woman. And so he sort of set a precedent, you know, so, you know, if Trump can do it, we can do it.
100%. And I'm so glad that you've had the opportunity to explain all these things, because really, these were all the reasons why I felt like this play had to be seen in this setting, and also why I really expect and hope that this play, Wedding Band, will get the stage time that it deserves, because it's, again, it loops back to everything you said. And yet the thing that I love about this, which I'd love to get your perspective on, is Alice is writing a love letter to working class Black women and sisterhood. Yes. And, you know, if it was a white woman writing this story, she'd focus on the trauma sort of porn of that, you know, like the sort of indulging in their pain and not showing the colors of humor and levity and joy. And the thing that moved me so much about this, you know, is there are incredible moments of levity and poetry and joy in this play. And no one could have done that and provided that kind of fullness outside of Alice in this context. And I'd love your thoughts on that too. You know, and all of her work.
There's some very beautiful moments. One of the moments I love is when she's reading, there's a character in the play called Maddie, you know, she's illiterate. And so her husband sends her letters from, you know, the military, he's overseas on a ship. And, you know, she asked Julia, who's the main character, to read her letters. And those are such beautiful moments. You know, he talked about how he misses her. You know, he sends her $10, which, you know, she says, I'm going to really use this money to take care of TT and get food and stuff. And, you know, I loved later, she says, I want to be your family. And they say, well, you are our family, you know, the women, they bond in the end. So there are a lot of great moments in the piece. You know, even when Julia talks about the things that she's always desired in her life, and, you know. Yeah.
It goes back to this quote. I think you had included it in the intro, and tell me if I'm going to sort of, I guess, generally quote it, but Alice said, I'm not ahead of my time. It's not that people are ahead of their time. They're choked in their time.
They're choked. Yeah, she hated people using the excuse, well, we can't do your play because it's ahead of its time. She just said, do you know how many times I had to hear that? You know, people aren't ahead, they're just choked. You know, they're just not allowed to do what needs to be done. This is Julia's story. You know, this is Julia's story. You know,
it's such a love letter.
Women. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, Julia also is one of my favorite characters I think I've ever read for so many reasons. But I actually wanted to segue, because you yourself had designed a production of Wedding Band in 2003, I believe.
2003, right? Yeah.
I'd love to see some of the images and for you to talk about, you know, how you approached it.
Before I go into that, I'm really sad that Childress won't be here to see her show on Broadway, but it really wasn't until after she died in 94 that you would see larger productions of some of her shows.
Mhm.
And the Steppenwolf is a major theater in Chicago. And I think this was the largest production that had ever been produced of wedding band. So I was working with people that I really knew, and I just love the production. As I said earlier, I'm a very subtle lighting designer. You know, I'm about advancing the story, helping the story. And it's not about my lights. And so the play takes place, we see three houses. This is Lula's house. She's the one with the adopted son, Nelson, who's here. This is Julia. So we see Julia's house. That's the only one we see inside of two of the houses. This is the woman's, Maddie's house, who can't read, that has the young girl, Tita. So, you know, it starts early in the morning. A lot of the scenes start very, very early in the morning. And like I say, these people are sort of like in the back of they're like in sort of an area in the city, but they're sort of this is almost like the back of the houses, a back area. And you can only come in through this gate. And then this is a moment with Julia and Herman. You know, he comes in, he gives her, and again, I don't want to give too much away. He gives her the wedding band, you know, on a chain, and they have their moments and stuff. That was a very special moment. The two of them, this is the first time you get to see them, the two of them interact. And, you know, it's a little awkward when Herman comes in, like I said, you know, this white man coming in late in the evening to this Black woman's house, and, you know, the neighbors are a little embarrassed about what's going on. So, but in terms of lighting it, let me just show you the last picture. I love this moment because, you know, it's the confrontation between Herman's mother and Julia. It's a very, very powerful moment. This was such a moving moment in the theater. You know, people were crying, and this character, and I can't think of her name, you know, she was old enough to know history and everything. It was a very difficult role for her to play. You know, she said she would just come off stage every night shaking because of what she had to say, you know. And I mean, and so was Julia, you know. It was, anyway, I won't go into details, but it's a very powerful moment in the play. And she would just come off stage every night shaking. It's like, I can't believe I had to say all this.
I feel like so much with those moments, again, without giving too much away, is, and I feel like I really mean it, like that introduction of the anthology you created was so effective, because it felt like in that moment, and then it confirmed it for me after rereading the context that you were beautifully laid out, was that it's like everything that Alice wished she could say, you know, it's like, that's the beauty of art, is it can be such an incredible, obviously doesn't resolve all the issues, as we know, because of all the injustices Alice had to encounter and many individuals still have to encounter. But it felt like a psychic, you know, her psyche being able to, her deepest feelings being able to kind of come out in that moment. And it was so raw and alive and unlike anything, despite even the subject matter. It was just one of the most incredible encounter scenes I had ever read, you know, and you can feel that power. So it's no surprise to me that they were shaking after doing it.
One of the things I want to say about particularly, well, even with her later plays, her focus was always on, you know, Black women. They were always at the center of her work. And they were usually Black women who had suppressed so much anger, so much, you know, racism, sexism. When it comes out, it just comes out, you know. You know, with Florence, the mother, you know, she reaches a point, she ends up grabbing this white woman and saying, wait, you can't do this. And she catches herself. You see this in Trouble in Mind. Willetta has been, you know, accepting all these stereotypical roles, and, you know, just reaches a point, I can't continue to do this. And then you see the same thing with Julia. So these women, they have reached a point where they just almost explode. Yeah, it becomes such a shock to the white person. It's like they don't know how to deal with it.
Well, it gives humanity to their rage, right? Which rage is human, but you know, as someone who like deeply cares about some of my Black peers and my Black close friends who are women, like and I'm sure you know this very well, this sort of projected angry Black woman archetype, and it totally is so damaging, but also really contextualizes it in such a way that if you were someone who needed to be in your protective bubble about people as a white person, it would rock your world. But to people who know that experience, either through knowing someone or who are living that experience, it is such a beautiful valve, a release valve to understand why one would be on the edge all the time,
Right. So, I'm excited about, hopefully you all will do the show, and
yes,
I'm very excited about Trouble in Mind. But what's interesting, and I was a couple of weeks ago, I was trying to think of a play by a female playwright on Broadway. There haven't been that many that has featured a Black woman as the main character that, that would confront racism, that would confront white people on stage. And I really couldn't think of any. I really couldn't. I mean, there was a Raisin in the Sun.
Yeah.
But it's actually Walter Lee that confronts the white guy. And then I would say for Color Girls may be the closest one, but they're talking maybe less about racism and more about,
each other.
And supporting each other. And there are no white characters in it. But I'm just thinking, hey, Childress is the only person I know that really has white characters in there that she is confronting. And the Black woman is at the center. Which is
a beautiful way for us to kind of tie up this conversation. We need more of these stories. Obviously, I know there are other up and coming Black female playwrights that are doing these things, but we have this incredible text now, and this incredible wealth of text that still hasn't fully received, the merit and the visibility that it deserves. And everything that you're saying just emphasizes that for me, and it's so meaningful to hear it from your mind and from your heart, given the context and experience you have. And there's really no doubt in my mind how valuable this work is, and I just love hearing your perspective on it. And I know our audience members will just love it. So I wanted to say, is there anything else you wanted to say before we say goodbye?
No, other than I would just love to see her work. I mean, it didn't have to be Broadway, but I would love to see more regional theaters, more schools do her work, just to get it out there, just to get it out there. And I appreciate the opportunity to come in and talk about Childress, and I hope to read about, Stratford during a production of it, and maybe I can come and light it.
And that's what I was thinking. I was like, that I think we know a perfect designer.
Yes. And I know all the stories. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. It has been such a pleasure, and you're such an engaging person to speak with. And I wanted to wish you all of the best, only the best, with this upcoming Broadway production. I wish I could see it, but I'm sure I'll hear about it. And I just wanted to thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.